The train car rattles through the darkness, steel wheels grinding against frozen tracks. Inside, men huddle in silence, their breath forming clouds in the bitter cold. These are not prisoners returning home. They are ghosts caught between two worlds, forgotten soldiers whose names were erased from official records, whose families were told they died heroes. But the truth is far more complicated. This is the story of Russian prisoners of war, men who survived battles only to become pawns in a game played by nations that once called them comrades. A hidden chapter of history where loyalty became a death sentence, and survival meant betrayal, where the line between enemy and ally blurred until it disappeared completely. The evidence begins in the rubble, archival photographs yellowed with age, documents stamped with classifications that remained sealed for decades, testimony from men who lived through what governments tried to bury, and in that evidence we find something unexpected. Not just the story of captivity, but a mirror reflecting the darkest calculations of power, the cold arithmetic of human worth. The year is 1945. The Eastern Front has collapsed. Millions of Soviet soldiers captured by German forces face a fate worse than death. Starvation in camps where a loaf of bread is currency, where survival means watching your comrade die and taking his boots. But liberation brings no relief. Because Joseph Stalin has already made his position clear, there are no Soviet prisoners of war, only traitors who surrendered instead of fighting to the death. The evidence is written in Stalin's own directives. Order number 270, signed in August 1941, it declares that any Soviet soldier who allows himself to be captured is a deserter, his family loses state support, his name becomes poison, and when he returns, if he returns, he will not go home, he will go to the Western forces liberating camps in Germany and Austria encounter a tragedy unfolding. Soviet soldiers freed from Nazi captivity, men who endured years of brutality, who dreamed of home, now terrified of repatriation, some beg not to be sent back. Others attempt suicide rather than face what awaits them in Soviet territory, and yet the agreements have already been signed. The Yalta Conference has sealed their fate. February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin sit together, dividing the post-war world, and among the many decisions made in those rooms, one receives little attention but carries enormous consequence. The agreement on repatriation. All Soviet citizens found in liberated territories must be returned to Soviet control. No exceptions, no asylum, no mercy. The American and British officers implementing this policy do not yet understand what they are doing. They see it as reuniting soldiers with their homeland, a humanitarian gesture. But the Soviet soldiers know better. They know they are being sent not to freedom but to accusation, not to celebration but to interrogation, not home but to hell. The operations begin in camps across Europe. American MPs and British soldiers rounding up Soviet nationals. Some go quietly, resigned to their fate. Others resist. There are reports of mass suicides. Men hanging themselves in barracks, jumping from trucks, slashing their wrists with whatever sharp edge they can find. One account describes a Russian officer who cut his own throat rather than board the train, his blood staining the snow as Allied soldiers looked away. But the policy continues. Ships loaded with repatriated Soviets leave European ports. Thousands cram below deck, sailing toward Odessa and Murmansk, toward processing centers where NKVD officers wait with files and questions, where the definition of collaboration is broad enough to condemn almost anyone, where having survived is itself suspicious. The evidence of what happened next was buried for 50 years, but survivors eventually spoke, and documents eventually surfaced, revealing a system of camps within camps. Screening operations where returned POWs faced tribunals that presumed guilt, where officers were shot for surrendering, where enlisted men were sent to forced labor battalions, where families were marked as relatives of traitors. One case file tells the story of Lieutenant Colonel Mikhail Petrov, a tank commander captured at Kursk after his entire unit was destroyed. He spent 3 years in Stalag IVB, survived on potato peels and hope, dreamed every night of his wife and daughter in Moscow. When the Americans liberated the camp in April 1945, he wept with joy, but that joy lasted only hours, before he was separated from other prisoners and loaded onto a Soviet truck. Petrov's interrogation record survived in KGB archives. Declassified decades later, it shows 17 days of questioning, accusations that he must have betrayed military secrets to survive so long in captivity, demands that he name other traitors among the prisoners, threats that his family would be arrested if he did not cooperate, and finally, a confession, signed with his name but in handwriting that barely resembles his own, admitting to anti-Soviet agitation, to spreading defeatist propaganda, to collaboration with fascist forces. The tribunal took 30 minutes. The sentence was 25 years hard labor. He was sent to Kolyma, the coldest edge of the Gulag system, where gold mines consumed men faster than the war had, where temperatures dropped so low that guards refused to patrol outside, where survival past 3 years was considered remarkable. Mikhail Petrov died in 1953, the year Stalin died, 3 months before the amnesty that might have freed him. His family never learned what happened, told only that he died heroically defending Stalingrad. a lie built on a lie. But not all Soviet POWs were returned, and that is where the story becomes even stranger, because while Stalin demanded total repatriation, some prisoners vanished into a different kind of silence, absorbed into another system, becoming ammunition in a different war, the Cold War that followed the hot one. Intelligence agencies on both sides recognized an opportunity. Soviet soldiers who refused repatriation, who had information about military installations, supply lines, unit compositions, men who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove, they became informants, defectors, living evidence that not everyone embraced communism, that cracks existed in the Soviet narrative of unity. The CIA and British intelligence ran operations with codenames like Red Sox and Valuable, recruiting former Soviet soldiers, training them in espionage techniques, then infiltrating them back into Soviet territory. Some succeeded in gathering intelligence, most were captured and executed, their names appearing in no records, their sacrifice acknowledged by no government, ghosts in every sense belonging nowhere, remembered by no one. And from the Soviet side, SMERSH and the NKVD ran their own operations, identifying prisoners who had cooperated with the West, who had shared information about Soviet defenses, who had accepted help from enemy intelligence. When these men were repatriated, they received special attention, not just imprisonment but interrogation designed to uncover Western intelligence methods, to identify other collaborators, to map the entire network of betrayal. The mathematical horror of the situation becomes clear. Tens of thousands of Soviet POWs repatriated. Of those, an estimated 60% faced some form of punishment. That means hundreds of thousands of men, liberated from Nazi camps only to enter Soviet ones. Soldiers who fought Hitler punished more severely than if they had simply died in battle, their crime being survival itself. But there were exchanges, secret negotiations that happened outside official channels, where individual prisoners became valuable enough to trade, not for humanitarian reasons but for strategic ones. A Soviet pilot who knew advanced aviation techniques exchanged for an American agent captured in Moscow, a rocket engineer traded for diplomatic concessions, human beings reduced to chess pieces, moved across borders in transactions that acknowledged them only as assets. One such exchange happened in 1952, at the border crossing between Austria and Czechoslovakia. 3 Soviet soldiers who had worked on the American atomic bomb project during their captivity, men who had swept floors and delivered supplies at Los Alamos, who had overheard conversations and seen blueprints, were returned to Soviet control in exchange for 2 British intelligence officers captured in Berlin. The transaction took 17 minutes, conducted in silence except for the reading of identification numbers. No one spoke names, no one shook hands. The prisoners crossed in opposite directions, walking past each other without acknowledgement, each group moving toward their own particular doom. The Soviet scientists were taken directly to a research facility outside Moscow, their knowledge extracted through months of debriefing, every detail they remembered about American nuclear research recorded and analyzed. When they had been emptied of useful information, when their memories had been cataloged and filed, they were sent to internal exile, forbidden to contact family, assigned new identities, erased from their own lives, living ghosts in the Soviet scientific apparatus. Archives reveal the bureaucratic language used in these exchanges: repatriation of Soviet citizens, return of liberated personnel, normalization of prisoner status, words designed to obscure the human cost, to transform suffering into administrative procedure, to make the unacceptable sound reasonable, and beneath that language, the reality, men treated as commodities, valued not for their humanity but for their utility. The families of these prisoners lived in a peculiar purgatory. If their soldier was officially declared dead, they received a letter and a pension. Grief was permitted, mourning was patriotic, but if the soldier was captured, the family became suspect, neighbors stopped speaking to them, children were rejected from universities, jobs disappeared, the stigma of having a relative who surrendered infected everyone, and so families often preferred death notices, better a heroic death than a living shame. One woman, Natalia Volkova, spent 12 years searching for her husband, a major in the Red Army captured at Kharkov. She wrote letters to every government office she could identify, sent inquiries to the Red Cross, traveled to Moscow 4 times to stand outside bureaucratic buildings, hoping someone would answer her questions. She was told he died in 1943, then told there was no record of his existence. Finally, in 1957, she received a letter. He had died in a labor camp in 1949. No explanation. No apology, just confirmation that her husband had been alive for 6 years after she was told he was dead, that he had been close enough to reach, yet completely unreachable. The psychological evidence is perhaps most devastating. Studies of Soviet POW survivors who eventually emigrated, psychiatric evaluations that reveal a particular form of trauma, not just from combat or captivity, but from the rejection by their own country, from being punished for surviving. Interviews describe men who could not trust, who refused to speak Russian even in private, who carried guilt not for anything they had done but for coming home alive when so many did not. One survivor, Anatoly Markov, interviewed in New York in 1989, described the moment he crossed back into Soviet territory, the way the guards looked at him, not with welcome but with suspicion, not as a liberated soldier but as a potential criminal. He said the worst part was not the years in the gulag that followed, but that first moment when he realized his own country saw him as the enemy, that he had spent 3 years dreaming of home and home did not want him back. The Cold War added another layer of complexity, because some prisoners became propaganda, voices used by both sides to prove the other's cruelty. Soviet defectors appearing on Western radio describing gulag conditions, captured American pilots shown on Soviet television confessing to biological warfare, each prisoner's story weaponized, transformed into ammunition in the ideological war, their testimonies sometimes true, sometimes coerced, sometimes rewritten until truth and propaganda became indistinguishable. The practice of trading prisoners continued through decades, formalized in 1962 with the exchange of Gary Powers for Rudolf Abel, a U-2 pilot for a Soviet spy, the model for future swaps. But for every public exchange on a bridge in Berlin, there were dozens of secret transfers. Men and women moved across borders under cover of darkness, their exchanges never announced, their fates never revealed, ghosts passing between systems that valued them only as leverage, and the Russian prisoners who refused repatriation, who accepted exile over return. They lived in a different kind of imprisonment, displaced persons camps that stretched on for years, eventually resettlement in countries where they would always be foreigners, where their accents marked them, where they carried the burden of being twice rejected, unwanted by their homeland, tolerated but not embraced by their adopted countries, living evidence of the Cold War's human cost. The evidence suggests approximately 5 million Soviet citizens were repatriated between 1945 and 1947. Of those, roughly 2 million faced criminal prosecution or were sent directly to gulag camps. Another 2 million were assigned to forced labor battalions or internal exile. Perhaps 1 million were allowed to return to their previous lives, though always under suspicion, always watched. The statistics are disputed. The Soviet government destroyed many records, but the general pattern is clear. Survival was punished, captivity was treason, and the price of being liberated by the wrong army was devastation. Today, the evidence remains scattered. Files in Russian archives still classified, testimony from aging survivors finally recorded before they disappear, photographs discovered in attics, letters found in desk drawers, each fragment revealing another piece of the story, the forgotten exchange between enemies, where prisoners became currency, where human lives were valued only for what they could reveal or conceal, where the greatest betrayal came not from enemy forces but from one's own government. The train continues through the darkness, steel wheels grinding against frozen tracks. But the men inside are no longer ghosts. They are voices demanding to be heard, stories refusing to remain buried, evidence of what happens when nations treat their own soldiers as expendable, when survival becomes suspicious, when the line between liberation and condemnation depends not on courage or sacrifice, but on which army finds you first. The question lingers like smoke in cold air. If you are captured by the enemy and survive, but your own country treats you as a traitor, who really took you prisoner, and who, if anyone, ever set you free?